At the heart of an ancient mountain range, where clouds embraced snow-capped peaks and the wind whispered timeless secrets, stood a modest stone cabin. It was here that an old monk had chosen to make his home 40 years ago, back when his hair had yet to take on the color of the snow covering the mountains around him. His decision to seek isolation had not been born from a single epiphany, but from countless moments of understanding, accumulating like raindrops, forming a river of wisdom. The cabin, built with his own hands during his first year on the mountain, told his story through each carefully placed stone. Its walls, though rustic, exuded a sense of protection that went beyond mere physical shelter. It was as if each stone had absorbed decades of deep meditation, creating a natural sanctuary where time seemed to flow differently. The villagers at the foot of the mountain held an almost mythical reverence for the old monk. With each change of the moon, a small group would climb the winding trail to bring offerings, baskets of rice, tea, candles, and incense. This tradition began when the monk, still in his early years of isolation, cured the village chief's son of a fever no doctor could treat. Since then, his silent presence had become a source of comfort and hope for the entire community. What most intrigued occasional visitors was the Zen garden the monk maintained beside his cabin. In stark contrast to the mountain's lush and sometimes chaotic nature, the garden was an exercise in simplicity and order. White sand, carefully raked into wave-like patterns, surrounded a few strategically placed rocks. It was here that the monk spent much of his mornings, moving with the grace of someone who had discovered that every gesture could be a form of meditation. On that particular afternoon, as clouds began to gather on the horizon, there was something different in the air. The old monk, who had developed a keen sensitivity to subtle changes in his environment, sensed that this would not be an ordinary day. The wind carried not only the promise of a storm, but also the scent of change. The kind of change that only occurs when fates intertwine in unexpected ways. The storm arrived with a fury that even the monk, accustomed to the mountain's extreme moods, found surprising. Rain fell in dense sheets, turning the trail into a muddy river as lightning tore across the sky in a display both beautiful and terrifying. It was at the height of this natural chaos that the sound of hurried footsteps mixed with the roar of thunder for the first time. A young merchant, drenched and shivering, burst through the cabin door as if fleeing invisible demons. His face, even through the rain, displayed a mix of exhaustion and anger. His fine clothes, now soaked and stained with mud, told the story of a long journey turned into a nightmare by the storm. In his hands, he clutched a leather bag that clearly contained something of great value, judging by the way he protected it. The contrast between the merchant's turbulent entrance and the monk's unshaken serenity was like a living tableau illustrating the two extremes of the human experience, the chaos of a restless mind and the peace of a tranquil spirit. The old monk, seated near the fire preparing tea, showed neither surprise nor disturbance at the sudden invasion of his sanctuary. His movements remained fluid and precise as he added more water to the kettle, as though he had been expecting this visit for decades. The merchant's labored breathing and the sound of water dripping from his clothes filled the space that had long known only silence and the crackling of the fire. His first words, when they finally came, were a taunt of complaints and accusations against fate, the gods, the weather, and his own bad luck. He spoke of ruined business deals, broken promises, and a fortune now at risk of being lost due to the storm. The old monk observed this display of unchecked emotion with the same attention he gave his Zen garden. In his eyes, there was a profound understanding that went beyond the immediate situation. He saw not just a drenched and angry man, but a soul tormented by inner storms far older and deeper than the one raging outside. The cabin, which moments earlier had been a sanctuary of peace and contemplation, became the stage for an encounter that would forever change the lives of its two occupants. The air, heavy with the scent of incense and tea, now carried the weight of unspoken expectations and lessons yet to be learned. It was the beginning of a journey neither could have foreseen, but for which both, in very different ways, had been preparing all their lives. As minutes turned into hours and the storm continued its assault on the mountain, a subtle shift began to occur within the cabin's atmosphere. The merchant, initially unable to contain his agitation, was gradually affected by the calm emanating not only from the monk, but from every object carefully arranged within the sacred space. The stone walls, silent witnesses to decades of meditation, seemed to absorb the visitor's chaotic energy, returning a sense of stability and safety in exchange. The fire, gently dancing in the hearth, cast shadows that moved like fleeting thoughts across the walls, reminding all present of the transient nature of everything, including the most intense emotions. It was during this moment of transition that the old monk performed his first true act of teaching, by remaining absolutely present and serene as chaos unfolded around him. He demonstrated, through living example, that true emotional mastery lies not in resisting or suppressing life's storms, but in finding the still center within them. The interior of the hut had transformed into a peculiar stage where two entirely opposing natures coexisted. On one side was the merchant, still drenched, his fine garments dripping onto the worn wooden floor, gesturing frantically as he recounted his saga of misfortunes. On the other, the old monk moved with the fluid grace of a calm river, preparing tea as if performing an ancient sacred ceremony. The merchant's tale unraveled like an endless thread of frustrations. He spoke of a caravan carrying precious goods that was supposed to have arrived in the imperial city before the new moon festival, of trade agreements that hinged on his punctuality, of competitors who would surely seize the opportunity to steal his most valuable clients. Every word he uttered carried the weight of fortune slipping away, reputations tarnished, and a prosperous future slipping through his fingers like sand. The wind howled outside, shaking the rice paper windows in their frames, creating an eerie soundtrack to the merchant's agitated monologue. Occasional flashes of lightning illuminated the hut's interior, momentarily revealing the contrasting expressions of the two men, one a mask of distress, the other a visage of unshakable serenity. The old monk continued his meticulous preparation of the tea, each movement a living demonstration of mindfulness. His wrinkled hands moved with studied precision as he heated the water to just the right temperature, measured the exact amount of green tea leaves, and waited for the perfect moment to steep them. It was as if, through this seemingly simple ritual, he offered a silent counterpoint to the emotional chaos that filled the room. Then came the moment that would change everything. The monk, having finished preparing the tea, began serving his guest. The ancient ceramic cup, marked by decades of use, was slowly filled with the fragrant green liquid. But when the tea reached the brim, the monk did not stop. He continued pouring with the same calm deliberation, letting the tea overflow and spill onto the low wooden table. The merchant, lost in his narrative of woes, abruptly halted at the sight of the spilling tea. His eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, his torrent of words ceased entirely. "What are you doing?" he exclaimed at last, his voice a mix of confusion and irritation. "The cup is full. Don't you see you're wasting the tea?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any verbal response could have been. The old monk finally stopped pouring, placing the teapot gently on the table. When his eyes met the merchant's, they held a depth that seemed to encompass all the wisdom of the mountains. Without a word, he made a sweeping gesture that encompassed both the overflowing cup and the merchant himself. The message, though unspoken, was as clear as mountain water. Just as the cup could not hold more tea when it was already full, a mind overflowing with agitation and worries could not receive new understanding. Confronted with this living demonstration of his own mental state, the merchant felt something shift within a small crack opening in a long shut window. The sound of the rain outside had softened to a gentle murmur, as if nature itself conspired to create a moment of clarity. The aroma of spilled tea filled the air, mingling with the scent of wet wood and the incense burning softly in a corner of the hut. It was a moment suspended in time, where every sensory detail seemed charged with meaning. The old monk rose silently and began cleaning the spilled tea. His movements were precise and deliberate, turning even this mundane task into a form of meditation. As he cleaned, his actions seemed to say, "Just as this spill can be cleaned with calm and attention, so too can our minds gradually be emptied of their excesses." The merchant watched, now in contemplative silence. For the first time since his abrupt arrival, he began to truly notice the details of the hut. The simple yet impeccably maintained utensils, the meticulous arrangement of every object, the natural harmony that radiated from every corner. It was as though he were seeing clearly for the first time after hours of blindness caused by his own agitation. As the night wore on, a new kind of silence settled in the hut. It was no longer the tense, charged silence of earlier, but something deeper and more meaningful. The merchant, still seated on his cushion, had ceased speaking of his troubles. His gaze now wandered between the fire dancing in the hearth and the serene movements of the monk, who had resumed his nightly routine as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The storm outside was beginning to abate, but something far more significant was occurring within the hut and within the merchant's heart. The lesson of the overflowing cup had planted a seed of understanding that was beginning to germinate. He started to realize that his mental agitation, his constant rush, his incessant concern with gains and losses, were like the overflowing tia, waste of energy that prevented any possibility of true wisdom or inner peace. The old monk, observing the subtle changes in his guest's demeanor, allowed himself a faint smile. The true journey of transformation had only just begun, but the first and most crucial step had been taken: the recognition that our greatest storms are the ones we create within our own minds. The dawn arrived quietly on the mountain, bringing with it air refreshed by the previous night's storm. The first rays of sunlight seeped through the cracks of the cabin, illuminating specks of dust that danced like ethereal beings in the still air. The merchant, who had slept fitfully on a simple futon, awoke to find the old monk already in motion, beginning a ritual that seemed as ancient as the mountains themselves. With deliberate and precise movements, the monk began to empty every container in the cabin. Large ceramic jars that held grains, small bottles of medicinal herbs, and decorative vases with dried flowers all were methodically emptied one by one. The sound of grains cascading into new vessels created a rhythmic music that echoed through the cabin, like a mantra materialized into sound. The merchant, still groggy and confused, watched the scene with growing curiosity. His first impulse was to question this apparent waste of time, this reorganization that seemed purposeless. Yet the lesson of the overflowing teacup from the previous night lingered in his mind, silencing his restless tongue and encouraging him to observe more attentively. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, its light revealed the hidden purpose behind the monk's actions. Each container, once emptied, was carefully cleaned and inspected. Some received small repairs with golden lacquer, an ancient technique that transformed cracks into golden lines. Others were simply cleaned and left to dry in the sunlight, their interiors exposed to the purifying morning light. The process stretched on for hours, evolving into a sort of meditative dance. The monk moved through the cabin with the grace of someone intimately familiar with every inch of the space, every object, and its purpose. His wrinkled hands treated each container with equal reverence, whether it was a valuable antique porcelain vase or a simple clay pot. At one point, the monk gestured for the merchant to join him in this task. Initially hesitant, the young visitor approached, his hands clumsy with the delicate nature of the work. The monk guided his movements without words, relying instead on gentle gestures and silent example. As he handled each container, the merchant began to notice something extraordinary. The emptier the object became, the more it seemed to gain in potential. A large rice jar, once emptied, was no longer merely a vessel for grains. It could hold water, flowers, or remain gloriously empty, its hollow interior resonating with unexplored possibilities. The silence that enveloped their work was neither empty nor oppressive. It was rich with meaning. It taught through direct experience, the feel of hands against ceramic, the sound of grains being transferred, the gradual transformation of the space around them. At one point, the monk led the merchant to the Zen garden, where the sand still bore the marks of the previous night's rain. With a bamboo rake, he began creating new patterns in the wet sand, erasing the remnants of the storm. Each stroke of the rake was like a breath steady, intentional, transformative. The merchant observed how even the sand needed to be emptied of its previous patterns to receive new ones. It was a living demonstration of how emptiness was not absence, but possibility. Each new groove in the sand was like a thought reorganized, an emotion understood in a new light. As the day progressed, the merchant realized he was participating in something far greater than a simple reorganization of objects. Each emptied container mirrored his own internal state. His worries about business, his anxiety about the future, and his anger at fate, all the contents filling his mind, perhaps needed the same treatment as the cabin's jars and pots. In a particularly poignant moment, the monk presented the merchant with an ancient ceremonial tea vessel. It was a beautiful piece, but what stood out was not its external decoration, but the emptiness within. The monk made a gentle gesture, inviting the merchant to peer inside. At first, he saw only darkness, but as his eyes adjusted, he began to notice how the light played on the vessel's interior walls, creating subtle nuances and reflections that were impossible to see when it was full. By the time the sun began its descent, the last piece had been returned to its place. The cabin, which had been a hive of activity throughout the day, returned to its apparent simplicity. But something had changed, not just in the physical space, but in the very atmosphere of the place. The merchant, seated on a meditation cushion, felt different. The weight of his concerns, though still present, seemed to have found a new space within his awareness. Like the now clean and organized containers, his mind began to find clarity between his thoughts. The old monk, observing the silent transformation of his guest, lit a fresh stick of incense. The smoke rose in delicate spirals, filling the space with its subtle fragrance, a gentle reminder that sometimes one must completely empty oneself to discover their true nature. The storm that had driven the merchant to the monk's cabin was not a passing phenomenon, as it had first seemed. It was the herald of a deeper seasonal shift in the mountains. The dense, heavy clouds had settled like a permanent shroud over the peaks, unleashing intermittent rain that turned trails into muddy streams and made descending the mountain a perilous impossibility. For the merchant, accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life with the precision of his trade scales, this forced stay on the mountain felt like an elaborate test crafted by fate itself. Each morning, he rose expecting clear skies, only to find the clouds thicker and more determined to hold him there, a prisoner of circumstance. The first days of this enforced wait were an exercise in pure agony. His body was present in the simplicity of the cabin, but his mind wandered constantly to the city markets, imagining lost opportunities, calculating losses, and weaving increasingly catastrophic scenarios about his future. It was as though two parallel realities existed: the tangible peace of the monk's cabin and the imaginary storm of his commercial anxieties. The old monk continued his unperturbed routine, treating the presence of his anxious guest as just another natural element of the landscape, like the rain or the wind. Each morning began before sunrise, with the soft sound of the meditation bell cutting through the pre-dawn silence. From his futon, the merchant watched through half-closed eyes as the monk moved in the dim light, lighting candles and incense with the same precision he displayed in full daylight. As the day stretched on, something began to change subtly. The merchant found himself anticipating the cabin's small daily rituals. He knew that after the morning meditation would come the preparation of green tea, followed by cleaning the space. He knew that at midday, rain or shine, the monk would dedicate an hour to tending the Zen garden, shielded only by a simple straw hat. He knew that by evening, the aroma of sandalwood incense would fill the cabin, marking the start of the nightly period of contemplation. This predictable rhythm, which at first seemed tedious to the merchant, began to reveal an unexpected depth. Every activity, no matter how simple, was performed by the monk with total presence and attention. The way he swept the floor was no different from the way he meditated. Every movement was precise, conscious, and complete in itself. On a particularly rainy day, when the sound of water on the wooden roof created a constant melody, the monk invited the merchant to take a more active role in the daily routine. He began by teaching him to chop wood for the fire, not just the physical act, but the art of selecting the right pieces, positioning them so that the cut was natural and efficient, and expressing gratitude to the wood for its sacrifice. The merchant discovered that every seemingly mundane task held hidden lessons. In sweeping the tatami mats, he learned the importance of attention to detail. In helping prepare the simple meals, he came to understand how each ingredient had its precise moment to be added, just as every action in life has its proper time for fruition. A particularly significant moment occurred during the tea ritual. Noticing that the merchant was becoming more centered, the monk allowed him to lead the entire ceremony. Every gesture, the heating of the water, the measuring of the tea, the motion of the bamboo whisk, chasen, required total presence. When the merchant's thoughts wandered back to his distant business concerns, the tea lost its harmony, becoming either too bitter or too weak. As the days turned into weeks, the silence of the mountain began to reveal its many layers. It was not a dead or empty silence, but something alive and vibrant. There was the silence of the morning, fresh and full of possibilities. The silence of midday, dense and contemplative. The silence of night, deep and mysterious. The merchant, who had once filled every moment with words and worries, began to savor these different flavors of silence. On a particularly clear night, when the clouds parted briefly to allow the full moon to illuminate the mountain, the monk led the merchant to the small altar in the corner of the cabin. There, he lit a single candle and, for the first time since the visitor's arrival, spoke. His voice, hoarse from disuse, sounded like stones rolling in a deep stream. "Observe the flame," he said. "See how it dances, fully present in each moment, without thinking of the next or lamenting the last." The merchant's sense of time began to shift subtly. The days, which had initially dragged on in agonizing anticipation, now flowed with a natural and organic rhythm. He began to see how each moment held its own completeness, how every activity, no matter how simple, deserved full attention and respect. The rain continued to fall outside, but it no longer felt like a prison. Instead, each droplet was like a reminder of the truth the monk had been demonstrating silently all along. That sometimes, we must be forced to stop to truly begin moving in the right direction. The old monk, observing the gradual transformation of his guest, allowed himself an almost imperceptible smile. The test of time was doing its work, patiently carving a new understanding into the merchant's soul, just as the rain, drop by drop, carves new paths into the mountain. As the weeks turned into months, the mountain began to reveal its cyclical nature to the merchant. The rain that had initially trapped him had given way to an explosion of springtime life. The slopes, once battered by storms, were now covered in wildflowers swaying in the morning breeze. It was as if nature itself was demonstrating a profound truth about impermanence and the natural cycles of life. The old monk, sensing that his guest was ready for deeper lessons, began incorporating the teachings of nature into their daily routine. On a particularly clear morning, he led the merchant to a small natural terrace on the mountainside. There, among ancient rocks covered in moss, grew a modest garden of medicinal herbs. Each plant, the monk explained through gestures, had its own cycle, its own wisdom. Some plants blossomed vigorously in spring, while others patiently awaited the summer heat. Some needed the direct strength of the sun, while others thrived in the protective shade of the rocks. The monk demonstrated how some herbs required regular pruning to grow stronger, while others were best left in their natural state. One day, as they worked together in the garden, the monk introduced the merchant to an ancient tea plant. Its gnarled branches and deep roots told of years of adapting to the mountain's conditions. With gentle gestures, the monk showed how the plant had grown not in spite of adversity, but through it. Every curve in its branches told a story of adaptation. Every knot in its trunk was a testament to resilience. The merchant began to notice how his own emotions followed patterns similar to the natural cycles he observed. There were days of emotional storms when old worries resurfaced to torment him, and days of absolute clarity when everything seemed to make sense. Instead of resisting these cycles as he had before, he started observing them with the same acceptance he had for the changes in nature. Summer arrived on the mountain, bringing intense heat that transformed the landscape once again. The Zen garden, which the merchant had learned to care for with great dedication, now required a different kind of attention. The sand needed to be dampened before raking, and the patterns had to be drawn deeper to withstand the strong sunlight. During these morning sessions in the garden, the monk taught by example how each season required a different approach. In the coolness of the morning, movements could be more vigorous. Under the midday heat, it was essential to conserve energy and work more gently. It was a living lesson in adaptation and responding to the conditions of the moment. One afternoon, as they rested under the shade of an ancient maple tree, the merchant had a profound realization. His business concerns, which once seemed so urgent and absolute, had transformed just as the landscape around him had. They hadn't disappeared entirely, but now occupied a different place in his awareness. The monk, recognizing this shift in his guest, led him to a small natural spring bubbling up between the rocks. There, he showed how the water found its path naturally, flowing around obstacles without losing its essence. It was a living metaphor for how emotions could flow freely when not dammed up or forced. As summer progressed, the merchant learned perhaps the subtlest lesson of all, the art of non-doing. He observed how the monk would sometimes simply sit on the terrace, seemingly doing nothing, yet profoundly attuned to everything around him. It was a state of being that went beyond mere inactivity, a form of conscious participation in the natural flow of life. In one of these shared contemplative moments, a butterfly landed on the merchant's shoulder. Instead of moving or trying to catch it, he remained perfectly still, savoring the delicacy of the moment. The monk gave a slight nod, acknowledging that his guest had grasped something fundamental about the nature of true peace. One morning, rising before sunrise for his usual meditation, the merchant experienced a deep understanding. He realized that just as the mountain remained unmoved while the seasons changed on its surface, there was within him a center of stillness that remained constant amidst the ebb and flow of his emotions. The old monk, observing his guest that morning, recognized the signs of profound transformation. The man who had arrived months earlier, restless and consumed by his emotions, had found his own natural rhythm. Like a tree that had finally achieved its perfect balance between growth and stability, the merchant had learned to dance with his emotions rather than fight against them. That night, as the stars shone with exceptional clarity over the mountain, the monk lit a small fire in the garden. The two men sat in silence, watching the flames dance in the breeze. They were no longer master and student, but two beings in harmony with the eternal cycles of nature, each on his own path of discovery and transformation. The merchant understood that every emotion, like every season, had its purpose and its own beauty. True wisdom lay not in controlling or suppressing, but in flowing with life's natural cycles, remaining rooted in an inner peace that, like the mountain, stood unshaken amidst all change. Remaining rooted in an inner peace that, like the mountain, stood an inner peace that, unshaken amidst all change. Remaining rooted in amidst all change. Autumn had arrived on the mountain, painting the slopes in hues of gold and crimson. One clear morning, the merchant awoke with a deep certainty. It was time to leave. Though the trails had dried weeks ago, something had kept him there, as if one final lesson still awaited him. The old monk seemed to sense the cycle nearing completion. That morning, instead of following their usual routine, he invited the merchant on one last walk up the mountain. As they climbed the trail leading to a higher point, the sunrise painted the sky in colors that mirrored the autumnal shades of the landscape. Reaching the summit of a small plateau, the monk sat on an ancient rock and gestured for the merchant to join him. From there, they could see the expanse of the valley below, the distant village, and the roads, stretching toward the world beyond the mountains. It felt as though they were suspended between heaven and earth, between the spiritual and material realms. For the second time since their time together began, the monk spoke. His voice, hoarse from disuse, carried the weight of the mountain's wisdom. "Look at the valley," he said, pointing to the scene below. "Do you see how the river finds its way? It doesn't fight the rocks or despair at obstacles. It flows around them, adapts, and continues on its path. This is the true nature of emotional mastery." The merchant gazed at the landscape in silence, letting the monk's words echo within him. In that moment, suspended between his old life and the new, the lessons of the past months seemed to converge into crystal clear understanding. He remembered his stormy arrival, how his emotions had been like the tempest, violent, chaotic, and destructive. He recalled the lesson of the overflowing cup, teaching him the need to empty himself to receive. He relived the silent days spent working with empty vessels, learning that emptiness was not absence but potential. The weeks of forced waiting had taught him patience and the value of time. The cycles of the seasons had shown him how each emotion, like each season, had its purpose and beauty. The Zen garden had become a mirror of his own mind, teaching him that serenity was not the absence of disturbance, but the ability to create harmony amidst chaos. The monk observed his disciple with a look of profound understanding. He saw in him the same serenity displayed by the mountains, not a lifeless rigidity, but a living stability, capable of absorbing and transforming any disturbance that arose. As they descended the mountain, the merchant realized he carried far more than when he had arrived. Not in his travel bag, which remained as light as ever, but in his heart and mind. He now understood that true emotional mastery was not a technique to be controlled, but a wisdom to be lived. The monk accompanied him to the trailhead leading to the village. There, he made one final gesture, pointing first to the merchant's heart and then to the mountain. The message was clear. The true mountain, the true master, now resided within him. Before departing, the merchant offered a deep bow. In that moment, the monk spoke for the last time, his words carrying the weight of all the wisdom they had shared. "Remember, your emotions are like the water of the river. They cannot truly be controlled by force, only guided with wisdom. True strength is not in resisting the current, but in learning to swim with it. True mastery is not in suppressing what you feel, but in remaining aware and centered as you feel. Like the mountain, stay rooted in your true nature, letting emotional storms pass like clouds in the sky." Years later, when people asked the merchant about his transformation, he would take them to the riverbank running through the city. There, he would share the wisdom he had learned on the mountain. Emotional mastery is not a battle to be won, but a dance to be danced. Just like this river, our emotions are a natural force, not enemies to be conquered, but teachers to be understood. True peace does not come from controlling the uncontrollable, but from finding our unshakable center amidst constant change. Every emotion, like every drop of water in this river, has its purpose and wisdom. Our task is not to dam the river, but to learn to navigate its waters with grace and understanding. The true master is not one who never feels, but one who remains conscious and centered amid all feelings. Like the mountain that remains steadfast while the seasons change on its surface, we too can learn to maintain our serenity as emotions flow through us. This is the true meaning of emotional mastery, not the absence of emotions, but the presence of wisdom within them.